Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Stepping Up by Mikindar, the Tiger Writes and Tie, the Tiger Supervisor. Today we are doing chapter 61, and of course, not where it should be. Tibs stared at the column blocking his way. It was in the doorway, and he couldn't understand why there would be a column there where a door should be. It was made of 12 thick discs stacked one atop the other, and each had a part taken out, as if some stone-eating creature had bitten into it once, then put it back, but hadn't bothered lining up those bites to allow him to use the gap that opened to go on the other side. "I think we broke him," Karen said. "Finally." That wasn't considerate of that creature. Tibs had to get to the other side, although he couldn't quite remember why. This had happened a few times before. You remember that, his loss of knowing why he was pushing forward. This time, he also knew it had to be because of how little sleep he got. Anytime he lost consciousness, those two would start screaming until he woke up and not stop until... Did they ever stop? "I think you're right," Val replied. It wasn't because of his hunger or his thirst. His hunger had decided quite a few unconsciousness ago it wasn't even worth clamoring for the pit to be filled, and the smell of food almost repelled him now. And the smell, and the smell of food almost repelled him now, instead of pulling him to the table that lined the corridors. Thirst, meanwhile, I simply closed his throat as a protest against his decision to no longer imbibe ale. Even swallowing was painful. His elements. That's why he was here. No, one of them. But which one? And couldn't they help with this somehow? He looked around, then headed for a table. What he needed was a nap. He crouched to move under. Karen and Val raised their voices. They weren't saying anything, just making sounds. Loud sounds. Far too loud. But Tibs was exhausted, so maybe He wanted to scream at them, but his throat constricted at the thought of pushing air through it. Air! That was why he was here. He stumbled to the column and stared at it. No, that couldn't be right. It was made of stone, mostly. And the other elements, of course, like everything. But the column had to go. It was blocking his way. He put his shoulder to it and started pushing. Val and Karen laughed. They kept on laughing as he pulled earth from the floor to increase his strength. They were right to laugh because the column won. Tibs' feet slid out from under him and he landed face first on the floor. He woke with a start to Karen screaming in his ear. Abyss! What had he done to deserve this kind of treatment? And they said corruption was the bad. Slowly got to his feet and blearily stared ahead. Right. He needed to get the column out of the way. He sighed resignedly, and put his shoulder to it again. This time crouching, so he had the edge of a bite as leverage point. This was about determination, so he just had to keep going, and What was he doing this for? Something clicked. He moved forward, slipped, then his head hit the floor, but he fought through the flashing lights to stay conscious. Karen screaming was helpful for that. He ignored the bloody handprint he left on the floor as he pushed himself to his feet. How often has he cut himself at this point? So often that he could actually feel a gap in his essence's reserve. Couldn't remember that ever happening before. It had to be wrong, since he was a runner, and remember that getting hurt was what runners did. But he didn't remember those times, so they didn't matter. He stared at the column. It was still there. It was still right there. He kicked it weakly. It had clicked. So why hadn't it gotten out of the way? That was how it worked. He did stuff, they went click, and he passed through. No, that wasn't quite right. He hit his temple with his palm. Come on, Tibs, think. He was usually good at that. He also usually slept and ate well. He stared at the column, cursing its presence, its very existence. Why couldn't it just have moved? He canted his head. Wait, something was different. He touched the place where he'd rested his shoulder, moved to put his shoulder against it again, but couldn't put as much weight against it because it was deeper. Yes, he'd moved it. He repositioned himself and pushed. He even pulled earth essence to him for more strength and remembered to anchor himself to the floor this time so he wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't slip. It didn't move. With a painful croak, he wanted to scream. He grabbed the other edge of it as he stepped away and pulled. Click, and rotated toward him. He stared. Then he kicked the column. It had clicked. So what was it still? Why was it? So what was it still? Why was it still there? Why? Why, oh why? Why was it still there? But it had clicked in the opposite direction he wanted to go. That was why. He pulled on it again, but it didn't move. He pushed, and it clicked. He pushed again and did nothing. He pulled and clicked, pushed and clicked. He did it again and again. He stopped when his throat hurt from trying to laugh and frowned. He grabbed hold of the bite before one above the one he'd moved. This one was more toward the center, so moving it wouldn't help him get through, but it didn't move in either direction. Do you think that? Val shushed Karen. He hears us, remember? He tried another one of the bites, or one higher than the floor, was close to the edge, and if it clicked, then when he pushed it, and it opened the gap, letting him get his arm through. Yes, he had it now. He needed to move them to that side, and he didn't even need to move all of them. He was small enough that if he got one below and one above, he'd be able to squeeze through. Of course, the one below wouldn't move, but the one above did, moving to the center, but no further. Pushed as hard as he could, then in frustration grunted and kicked the one at the floor. He hurt his foot, but he ignored that. The one he kicked had moved. Not enough to click, but closer. He pushed it, and it clicked. Then it wouldn't move anymore. Two more, and he would open the gap. He pushed harder. He pushed as hard as he could, but it didn't move. But it didn't move. Neither did the one he'd moved before. But he made progress. Progress was good. It meant he hadn't given up. And that was the most important thing. And that they had moved meant something. It had to be important because Karen had almost said something when she'd started this. Air. It was about air. No, it wasn't air. The column was stone, so earth. But there was something about air. It was around him. Could he get it to push with him? He didn't have much reserve, so it would take longer to gather what he needed, but he had time. That wasn't right. To gather, but he had time. That wasn't right. To gather as much as he needed. And it meant he was still pushing forward. That was the important thing. He pushed the air essence out, and it spread, letting him make more of it is. He stepped to the column and concentrated what he had on the side of the bite at the floor. When he used it to push, it spread around it instead of moving it, letting Tibs sense its shape, the thin gap between it and the one above, and what was that? The disc was hollow, and in the center was something? Many something, rods and gears and holes for some of them to move in and out of. It was important. You almost had it. That was a solution. It had to be. It was something. He rested his head against the column in frustration. He tried banging it at some point, but it didn't help. Think, Tibs, think. Sense. The center of the column was hollow from the bottom of the disc to the top, and the hollowness was filled with all these things, and they connected to each other and the disc via rods and gears, and he almost banged his head, but stopped. And he could sense what happened to them when he moved a disc. He pulled the floor disc, and the motion turned the gear. That turned the shaft, and that turned many gears, some of which pulled rods deeper into the center or against a disc, against a hole in the disc which will hold it in place. That was it. So, how did he use that to move the column out of his way? He pushed and pulled on the bite and sensed the mechanism. That's what it was. That's what that was. That's what that was. That's what that was. A mechanism. Move. Oh, I see. Okay. So this is what. A mechanism. Move. Trying to understand what the motion meant. It meant that what he did with this disc affected the others, and what he did on them would affect this one. Just had to work out which one affected the other and in what way. He tried one slice after the other, and the seventh from the floor moved forward. Kept his elation in check. This could be a trick from the dungeon. Dungeons were tricky that way. He reached the top without any moving, and almost gave in to despair, but went back to the bottom again. The fourth one from the bottom pushed toward the edge, and Tibs danced with joy. He was right. That was how it worked. All he needed to do was push until the gap was open and he was through. On the next pass, the 8 from the ground moved. On the one after that, none of them moved. What could that be? They weren't all in place. Only 3 were in the opening, and not 2 of them in the same next to another. No, he had been so sure this was the way. Had to be. He went through each disc again, pushing as hard as he could. He slumped on the floor and felt like crying. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to go home to Craggle Rock, hang out with Jackal and Karina and Kumdar and even Maz, because even if he wasn't nice to be around right now, he was still his friend. You can leave, Val said, or had said. There was no shame in it. He couldn't tell anymore when they were talking or when he was remembering them talking. Unless they were yelling. That was always what they did. Unless they were yelling. That was always what they were doing then. Okay, unless they were yelling. That was always happening in the now. He never remembered them yelling. He stood. He wasn't leaving until he was done, and that meant getting through this door. He tried pushing them again, and of course, they didn't move. The only one that would move was the last, but only to pull back into its previous position. He did it a few times, and since the gears and rod move, trying to understand why they wouldn't move forward anymore. Then he tried again to push the discs that weren't in the right position. At one point, putting his back to the edge of the bite and his foot on the one below to give himself more of something he couldn't remember the word for that would make it work better. He ended up on his back. When the pain of hitting his head cleared, he stared in horror at the bite, which had moved back one step. That was impossible. They had to move forward. That wasn't the one that he'd moved last. He hurried to put it back in position and hoped no one noticed. Then he looked at it again. Could the dungeon be that true? Could she get him this close? Could she get him? Could she let him get this close and just force him to undo everything? Yes, Val could be cruel, especially with Craren giving her ideas. But no, she wouldn't get him to undo everything. She was a dungeon, and dungeon existed to test people. They could cheat, still did, but Val stuck to the rules. She even complained about doing it too much. Tentatively, Tibs pushed on the other bites and one moved forward. Immediately, he tried to put the one that had moved back in its proper position, but it didn't want to move. Why? Why was this so hard? He banged his head against the column in frustration, and a thought came to him. He had trouble grasping it, something about a cylinder that had been given to him. Lent. He made that clear, and how there were rings on it, like this column, and something in how he moved the pieces, the tiles on the floor in one of the previous rooms, more than one. How they slid, and something he had to do so he could get the solution. Find he wailed. He almost had it. It was right there in the pattern of the idea. The pattern. There had been a point where with each of them where he couldn't move forward anymore unless he moved back. That made no sense. No, it did, because he didn't move back blindly. He had to find the pattern in moving back that let him move forward. With a shaking hand, he tried each disc, pulling and pushing. He almost stopped when one that was in the right position pulled out of it with a click. He closed his eyes. He saw his surrounding with the air essence he had spread. He forced himself to stop thinking of this as a door he needed to get through. It was a puzzle, nothing more. One that he solved by lining up the bites in this position. Not because it let him pass, but simply because that was how the solution was. He pulled and pushed each one in turn, noting how and if they could, sensing the mechanism. The pattern was long enough that more than once he woke to Kraken screaming at him, and he had to start from the beginning because he forgot what he was trying to do. When he had two adjacent gaps in the right position, Tibs tried to squeeze through and broke down when he couldn't. Once he was done, he got back to it, getting close to lining up a third gap before the pattern he had to follow undid everything. When he had 4 bites in position, then he had 4 bites in position, but none were adjacent. It undid again, and he continued through the despair. What else could he do? Give up? Have Craren beat him? She was the vicious one. That was just a dungeon, doing what she was told. She wouldn't do this if not for Craren. He was sure of it. He had 3 adjacent bites lined up, only to discover it wasn't enough. No matter how he contorted himself, his shoulders wouldn't fit. The world collapsed as the pattern undid his work. The idea that it would reform was difficult to hang on to, as it seemed to take even longer for it to reform. Only the glee he imagined Craren expressing as he gave up kept him going. She might have tortured him for an eternity, but she wasn't going to beat him. The clicking of the turning of disc became a drone, and more than once he wanted to stop just to have some silence. Click, click, click. Clicking was the word, and pushing and pulling in time with the clicking. Stopping would end the world, he was sure of that. When he had 4 adjacent gaps. Oh, wait a minute. No, I've got it. When he had 4 adjacent gaps, he hesitated. There were 3 off the ground, but he wasn't worried about the short climb. What if he didn't fit? Could he survive tearing his world apart? Apart again and hope he could reform it? Is he really doing it? It was the awe in Karen's voice that prodded him forward. He didn't have long until she told Val to do something to stop him. He was sure of it. He pulled himself up, then got stuck partly in. He wriggled and pulled and pushed. Was that her trap to get him stuck here forever? He croaked in fear as he unstuck himself and fell forward and kept on falling. And this concludes chapter 61 of Stepping Up. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, you can do that on Royal Road for free. If you want to support me and read further ahead and read other stories I've written, you can do that on my Patreon. And if you want to watch me, listen to me do these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.